Hello and welcome to a Monster Mechanics bonus episode. I'm your host, Scott Paladin, and with me as always is the heireth to my Tifa, Zach Jaquays.
How's it going?
And with us as never is the Carmen Sandiego to our Tifa and heireth, Luke Lukas.
Hello, it's good to be here.
So Luke has started listening to the podcast recently, and he texted me that he had questions. And so I decided that I needed to get him in just so that I could hopefully infect him with the disease that Zach and I already have, that he might start his own at some point. So here he is to ask us questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much for letting me be on.
Of course.
I've been a long-time listener, first-time caller, so to speak.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's really good to be here. And I just really love the way that y'all have just completely opened this entire world. Listening to Monster Mechanics, I really want to know kind of how this all got started for you. You're both very well versed in monsters and their lore. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious what that original monster or idea was that spawned this show.
Well, the sad secret of it is that Zach and I have been doing this almost exact thing for like 15 years or something like that.
Easily, yeah.
Yeah, we met at freshman orientation in college. He was sitting on the row in front of me, and I think I heard him mention something about D&D and tapped him on the shoulder. And so we started talking like that. And so the number of nights that he and I have spent up late at like 2 a.m. talking about some weird fantasy or sci-fi thing and just coming up with weird ideas that never end up going anywhere, or most of the time don't end up going anywhere, is like basically, in that sense, we just turned a mic on and started doing what we were already doing.
Yeah, that's pretty much what we did. Like, we would always just be bouncing ideas for stories, or both of us have DM'd for Dungeons and Dragons at one point or another, and we would always bounce ideas off each other, and it always just kind of spiraled. And so, like, maybe we should, turn a mic on and see what happens.
Yeah, it's kind of, so it sounds like it kind of evolved organically and just became this whole new monster, no pun intended, of which we're a part of now. You both mentioned that you've DM'd in the past.
Yeah.
I am familiar enough with the world of RPG to know kind of what that means. But I'm also very much a newbie. I consider myself maybe RPG adjacent, but not necessarily have I ever kind of explored that world myself to any real degree. So I'm really curious, listening to the show, I hear you guys say quite a bit. I mean, you're waxing about these ideas and you say, I like that. And indeed, I like many of the ideas as well, but I'm really curious, what happens next? How are these ideas applied to another setting, like a game or something like that?
Honestly, I think we take no responsibility for how these ideas are used.
Yeah, I mean, we don't. There was talk early on about us pushing some of these things into more concrete forms. Either, like actually coming up with like monster sheets or stat blocks to use in games, things like that. But the truth of it is, especially when you're like, we mostly talk about this in the frame of RPGs. If you're going to be a DM and we provide you with an idea, then like a lot of what's going to happen is then you taking that and making it work in your world. Like, we're not trying to hand people something that's like prepackaged, ready to go. It's all about these little jumping off points. So if we say something that's useful to somebody else and that makes them go, oh, what about, well, they said this, what about that? That's really where we want to go with, like, that's what we want to provide, is that jumping off point. And so we provide like a framework and also just sort of the habit of sort of asking the next question. Like, that's whenever we start talking about something, a lot of times it's about, well, what's the implication of, if this is true, then what does that mean for X and Y? And that's that starting with that first supposition and then moving on into the consequences of it. That's where a bunch of really neat ideas come from, where you're talking about, well, this flows out of that.
For me, it's like the butterfly effect of, well, because this monster does this, this must also be true, has always been very interesting to me. Just kind of observing the ramifications of why this monster is the way it is and how that affects the world around it has always been very interesting to me.
Yeah. So it's mostly about sort of engendering a philosophy. God, I don't like the way that sounds kind of haughty, but like a mode of thinking about creatures in fantasy worlds and sci-fi worlds where you more fully integrate them and always think about the consequences and following the rabbit hole where it goes, because that's almost always someplace interesting.
Like for me, just to hear someone's like, hey, I took this idea or this portion of the idea that you guys talked about on one of your episodes and took it in a completely different direction. I would love to hear about that from any of our listeners. That just sounds...
Oh, yeah.
Like
100%. Yeah, I cannot agree with that enough. That would be so cool. Like hearing somebody else's take on something it would be brilliant.
Well,
okay, sorry. I have to tell a story real quick. Sorry.
Please.
Just on that exact note, because if you follow my Twitter account, you know that I constantly am throwing out portmanteaus and pun names for superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
That's like 40% of my content. And I was so pleased because somebody told me the other day that they used one of them as an NPC in their game. I'm just like, yes, that is so cool. Like I was like, I felt super proud that somebody pulled it.
It's all about that organic reach, that organic growth. I mean, if somebody hears something and runs with it, that actually does make me think about another question I have.
Yeah.
The episode on xenomorphs was kind of a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah.
And that's partially because of all of these subjects y'all explored, it's probably the monster lore that I kind of knew the most about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of felt like I had more skin in the game, so to speak.
Naturally.
But one thing that I noticed in the exploration of that episode of Xenomorphs is it kind of makes me think that a lot of the IPs that are presented as movies are kind of lazy. Because I think some of the ideas that are presented on your show are like, did they just not bother to have a session, a 10-minute session to think about this? And so I'd love to hear what y'all think about that.
Especially movies, also TV shows. Yeah, they don't have time to think about like the next idea where they ask the questions about what's the implications of this or that. So yeah, they're lazy is maybe not the right term because maybe it's just that their priorities are in a different direction. Because they're talking about what makes a compelling visual image, what makes a compelling short story, because that's what movies are. They're very short. And so like, it's about like where they put the time and the energy rather than huge, big, expansive world building with lots of complex ideas. That's very much like book realm. If you want those kinds of answers, you almost always have to go to somebody like a Brandon Sanderson or Andy Weir, somebody like that, who just like is constantly thinking about that next question.
Yeah. Movies are always going to tend to be a little more character focused. And so if you want to expand on those ideas, you kind of have to find another medium to do that, which is why there's always extended universe stuff for things like Star Wars or Aliens or whatnot, because they do have those ideas. They just don't have a medium to show them in necessarily with movies.
Yeah.
Well, related back to kind of the RPG efficacy or usefulness of these discussions, and this is definitely a 101 question, so I'm sure a lot of your listeners might be like, come on, this guy. But I'm curious, once again, on the episode about Xenomorphs, do people play RPGs that are based in kind of more of a sci-fi or alien kind of realm, or is it typically the kind of traditional fantasy lore that we always hear about?
So the giant juggernaut in the room is always D&D. For tons of people, Dungeons and Dragons is synonymous with RPGs, and that has never been built well to do sci-fi. There is a supplement for it called Spelljammer, which I really love, which is meant to take sort of sci-fi ideas and bring them into the fantasy world. But that's kind of it for D&D. But there are some licensed RPGs. In fact, there is an Aliens universe licensed RPG that I heard about the other day, which sounds wild. It's got like rules in it for like ship on ship combat. Even like they went deep onto making this that RPG real. But there's an endless number of sci-fi like indie RPGs and things like that where somebody will just sit down and like come up with an idea. And they'll make a little tiny one. They'll put it up on itch.io and stuff. So there are things out there. There's definitely people playing in that space. In fact, what's the one that everybody really likes? Is it Traveler? That's kind of the biggest sci-fi RPG for a while.
I should know this, but I don't.
Yeah. That Traveler is, I think, really big. There's a couple of other ones. Stars Without Number, I know, is really good. So there's lots of places in that sci-fi realm to go to, and there's also
there's like the Star Wars RPG.
Of course. Why didn't I? Yeah.
Of course, Star Wars is that perfect blend of what we would sci-fi and fantasy. It actually seems more appropriate for the fantasy realm. it does make me think about the level of detail that is explored on a show like Monster Mechanics, and how that ties into a certain believability.
Mm-hmm.
With that in mind, I'm just curious, and this is another one of those RPG 101s, but how, like, the ideas, like, you guys are presenting ideas, you're coming up with ideas that make these worlds more fleshed out and believable. How does a group of players have to buy into those ideas? Or how much is a gaming session, that process of creating as you go, happening? Or I don't know if I'm asking that very well, but
no, that's a reasonable question. It's going to vary from table to table, like, because anytime a group of people sit down to play a game where it's about the imagination, all of what comes out of that is going to come from those people's minds. So there are some groups who are just going to be able to suspend their disbelief completely and say any kind of BS that is thrown at them are just going to go, yeah, okay, great, let's just keep going with that. So there's lots of people who are just going to totally buy into it, and there are other people out there who, the moment that they hear something that sounds wrong, they have to say something. I've played with players like that. I have been that player where, like, the moment that the DM says you go hunting and you find it's the middle of the night, you find a rabbit or something like that, and I'd be like, well, rabbits aren't out in the middle of the night. They're diurnal. They don't come up, or not diurnal. They're dusk and dawn, whatever the dusk and dawn one is. So it's like, and so there's that thing where it can something like that can twig a player and go, oh, that removes me from losing myself in the game because it's inaccurate. So it's really kind of person to person, and making something believable does go a long way towards selling it, even if that's not something someone's super concerned about. Because if you've thought about the consequences of an idea, then that world will gel in a better way. Like, it's not going to be made up of component parts with big giant stitches between them and duct tape. It's going to feel more like a cohesive world or a cohesive experience, at least in my opinion.
And I think one thing about kind of expanding this level of believability and having those kind of answers for your players is it'll pique players' curiosity, because the first time a player, scratches at the surface of something that you've said, and you suddenly have a much more in-depth answer for them that makes sense, they're going to be more curious about other parts of your world. They're going to ask more questions. On the flip side of that, if they ask a question and you just kind of hand wave it, they're going to be like, oh, well, okay.
Yeah. Or you say because.
Yeah. Then they're just going to be like, oh, well, okay. Then, and they're going to be less curious about your world and more willing to take things just at face value because that's what the DM said. That's how it is. Yeah. Don't ask questions, that kind of thing.
And also, on that note, engendering in a listener the idea that when you hear a good idea, if you hear an idea that's better than yours, to then pick it up and run with it is something I would love people to take away from what we do. Because I never want to. I try so hard to, when I hear something that Zach says, and if it's good, even if it's something I didn't come up with, I want to make that the reality at that point. And so if you're the GM and you're at the table and and one of your players says something, oh, what about this? And you go, oh, that's good. Run with it. Make that the reality now. That's the philosophy that really ought to come out of this, is the idea of, like, the best idea wins. Doesn't matter who says it or anything like that. If it fits, if it makes the world better, use that.
Yeah, I think all too often there's kind of the notion that the DM is the end all be all to the story. But I think if you put some of that responsibility in the player's hands, you almost always end up with a better story told.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a collaborative yes and that is happening. There's a bit of a building.
Absolutely.
There's a bunch of podcasts out there with people, especially coming out of Chicago. All of those people who've paid for classes at Second City and have done improv camp and have been spending their years becoming good improvers, and then they suddenly start a podcast where they start doing role-playing games. They have a tendency to hit the ground running. You can grab one of those guys and they'll just go with it, because they've been training all of those muscles for so long. Not to say that you have to do those things in order to become a good player. There's 100 different types of play to have, different ways to have fun. But those guys are working out a bunch of the muscles that they end up using in those kinds of situations.
Mm-hmm.
I dig that. I have a few very episode specific questions that came out of my listening that I really want y'all to elaborate on.
Okay.
I found myself, again, because of how natural the conversation is between the two of you, at times wanting to just speak into the ether to see if you guys can hear. So again, I want you to elaborate on a few things.
Sure. Real quick, if you or any of our other listeners have that feeling, at Monster Mechanics on Twitter, please hit us up with that kind of stuff.
Okay, so here's my question. I really liked the dragons episode. Again, I probably have more of an awareness of what dragons are in my my imagination due to their role in popular culture.
Yeah, of course.
So whenever the conversation kind of went to talking about how a dragon might hoard power without really knowing why they're doing it, it's almost like this compulsion they have. For some reason, that led me to wondering do dragons have a sense of humor or a sense of irony?
So I feel like it's going to kind of vary from dragon to dragon, but I would say absolutely yes. I mean, there's got to be kind of like, at least with sort of the classic Dungeons and Dragons dragon, there's got to be that kind of joy and that cruel joy in meddling with players and being more powerful at the expense of others has got to, tweak that little muscle for them. So.
Yeah, and my response is I love the idea of an intelligence that is alien enough from humans that it doesn't have aspects like that to us. If you want to make your dragons very relatable and like sort of friendly, or not friendly, but at least something that like is easy to model for the human for your players or your readers or whatnot, then giving the dragon a sense of humor is going to make it feel a lot more like a human character. Whereas if you emphasize the fact that it doesn't understand this kind of thing at all, makes it feel stranger and more alien. Sometimes in a comic way, like you could just have it not get metaphors like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy, and it has to speak literally and it doesn't understand anything else. And that's a good joke. But there's also the idea that, they are a cold, calculating intelligence that has its own motives, but that means it's going to be harder for your players to understand it and get to know it, basically. And that can make it feel alien, which I think would be really cool. So you could really explore that in either direction of like making them, very like just like big evil humans or good humans if there's good dragons, or you could make them very strange, whichever tickles your pickle, basically.
Yeah, I was thinking that, and not necessarily that it would even be humor that we would recognize, but if they would ever be doing something motivated to kind of, not necessarily to have a last laugh, but if that would factor into the motivation of why a dragon would do what they do, would be simply to kind of just get their kicks,
Yeah. That twigs an idea to me where of them having a sense of humor that is foreign to humans, to like present them with something that they think is really funny, but that your audience just goes, what? Huh? And
Dragon's just like, it's a prank, bro.
Yeah. Or like, yeah. And that could be compelling. That can make for an interesting characterization where they think it's hilarious that humans walk around on two legs. And like every time they see a human walking, it like makes them chuckle or something like that. Where it doesn't seem like it would be obviously funny to us, but to them, it's just like, it's bizarre. Or something like lying or something like that, where like they don't do it, but the moment they hear a lie, it's the funniest thing they've ever heard.
I like that. Yeah,
that could be really compelling to take it in another direction where they have it, but it's not human. In fact, actually, on that thought, humans typically respond to like our humor is almost always based in surprise. Like it's taking something that where you've established pattern, unexpected result to that pattern. That's like where wordplay comes from. It's almost always some version of surprise. In fact, humans, even when they're not presented with a joke, they're just surprised, we'll laugh. Like that's our natural response to these things. And so you could figure out a different trigger for an animal like a dragon and say, oh no, it's not surprise for them. It is contradiction specifically. And so that is what all of their humor is built around, where it's like, I'm having a hard time even formulating how a joke might work.
Humor based on denial.
Yeah. Where like, or just things like saying one thing and then immediately saying the opposite of it, it's nice to meet you. No, it's not, like and just the putting those two things together might twig a dragon into laughing or something like that. And coming up with something really foreign could be kind of cool.
Where the phrase "psych" is the highest of dragon humor.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting to think, and this might be me stepping on a ledge a little bit, but it's interesting to think about how maybe humor could be, if humor is something that dragons don't identify or they don't recognize, even if they were to have some sort of intelligence, it's something that just doesn't make sense to them. To me, it might introduce an interesting mechanic of how one might kind of outwit a dragon or somehow be able to communicate in the presence of a dragon without it necessarily understanding the subtext.
Yeah, if they're very literal and you use metaphors or sort of sarcasm and stuff like that, you could have a conversation directly in front of one. That's kind of cool. That would be a fun scene to see in a story where two characters get something in under a dragon's nose because they're speaking, sort of hinting at something that it's just not picking up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. If you on that note, I was just reminded of the best Star Trek: The Next Generation episode of all, which is Darmok, where they communicate only in metaphors. And so there's this whole episode about like sort of the very first linguistics road to be taken when two new cultures interact, and their modes of communications are very, very different. And so it's about like teaching both the character in the universe and the audience how to speak this language. And it's super effective. If you want to learn a little bit about how to tell a language story well, go watch the Next Generation episode Darmok. It's so good.
Okay, I have another question that was spawned directly from one of your episodes, and this was on the fantasy races episode, which was also one of my favorite to listen to because I am almost ashamed to say I had a pretty narrow view of what these different fantasy races were, what dwarves and elves and things like that were, largely based on things like the Lord of the Rings. So I was very into the elaboration of those cultures and those species, really. Mm-hmm. In particular, I was really digging how y'all were talking about elves and how they may eventually actually turn into things like trees or some sort of woodland thing. But I would love to hear what you guys think about if elves, or maybe more appropriately dwarves or one of these other fantasy races, were to develop to the technological level of humans, maybe even developing spacecraft or developing aircraft or anything like that. I just would like to hear you guys talk a little bit more about that.
So specifically our elves, or like
it's almost like where you guys ended by talking about things like elves being obviously very rooted in nature. And really, I think this applies more to dwarves because of how the discussion was them being more tactile based and obviously working with raw materials. I just wonder if you see an evolution continuing along that same line in several thousand years of this. It's not even in that fantasy setting anymore. It looks modern.
There's in fact that taking the fantasy races forward into sci-fi is the basis for a couple of different worlds out there. What's the one I'm thinking of? Shadowrun is the most obvious example, which is like if Tolkien's world was cyberpunk, basically, is what Shadowrun is. The first thing that when you start talking about elves and spaceships, the thing that comes to mind is a world ship moving through space, the empty space with a forest inside of it of all of the ancient elder trees that are the end stage of that society. That's pretty cool. In fact, with a long-lived species like that, the idea of how long the great distances between planets and star systems would like not be such a big deal. Okay, so it takes you 50 years to get somewhere. That's not a big deal if you live to be 1,000. It's a long journey, but it's not that big of a deal. And so maybe that's an aid in them sort of like colonizing. That'd be very cool.
Mm-hmm. And I think with kind of like the more nature-based, like their technology is probably going to steer around like the combustion engine and focus probably almost initially on solar power to start with.
Oh yeah, for sure. That'd be very cool.
Like they just have that biological mechanism like built into their systems. And so it would just be natural for them to expand along that line in their technology.
Actually, a very cool contrast would be seeing like a solar system that had been colonized by both dwarves and elves, and they had pretty much divvied it up. Because one of the thoughts I was thinking was the dwarves, our version of them are made of stone, and they don't, to that implication, wouldn't need things like air. And so they might go out and like take over an asteroid belt and never like build any stations or anything like that. They, you know, would just stand on the surface of an asteroid and use the rock the same way they would use the rock on a planet. And so they would be able to make use of resources that other species were unable to. Whereas the elves might come in and like bioengineer giant trees that terraform the atmosphere of a small planet, and then they would live there. And like you have this sort of bifurcated, like, you know, whichever one's leaving off and can't use of an area, the other species comes in and like that's where they you know, they can make use of it. It's kind of a use every part of the buffalo kind of scenario with these various groups coming in. That'd be really cool.
I also kind of love the idea that maybe dwarves don't even really have a notion of spacecraft so much as just launching dwarves into space because they don't need atmosphere.
Yeah, that'd be cool. And like you always have to have like a crew. Like if you send a spaceship out, it's better to just hire dwarf engineers because they don't need spacesuits, and you can like depressurize their section of the ship, and they're just fine with it. That'd be really cool.
Kind of related to those last two questions. I'm curious. This is pretty open ended, but I'm curious if you guys, after you're about 12 episodes in, if you have any kind of victory laps you'd like to explore with any of the monsters you've discussed so far, things that maybe came up after you were finished recording that you're just like, wow, I really have thought more about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I want us to revisit illithids. I think that there's a lot more for us to talk to about those creatures. They're so strange.
They are just such a weird, gross race of creatures.
Yeah. And so I've put off us revisiting anything for this first section of episodes and stuff. So that's definitely in the cards, you know, sometime in the near future, probably for us to go back and redo. I think there's some stuff that we probably left out. The version of them we created where they feast on memories is such a great idea. I'd like to see, I don't know, that just like how their societies might work a little bit more. And I love, that the whole idea of them being fearing infinity is a great idea. I'd love to build into that myth more. So there's all ideas like these are almost fractal in nature. You can like always kind of find some subset of it. You go, oh, we didn't talk about this enough, you know, like illithid cooking, right? Like intelligent creatures, like they cook things. There's culinary, aspects of it. And so like, what would that look like? I mean, it'd obviously be very disgusting and gross, but like, we don't shy away from that. But like the ability like to like look into what they would do, what would they be looking for? You know, maybe the actual physical preparation of the brains themselves doesn't matter, but maybe it's something about like prepping the subject with new memories for you to devour. Like that's a bizarre idea that could go some weird places, man.
Seasoned with childhood trauma to taste.
Right. I gotta say, listening to that Illithids episode, I did listen to the show more or less chronologically, and that one just kind of, it was hard, no pun intended, it was hard for me to get my brain around that one just because those things sound so disgusting the way that they were being described.
Yeah, and I mean, that's actually one of the shames. I think they get underutilized in D&D a lot because you don't delve into that section of them. They kind of just show up and fight the heroes, and you don't really look into their lives at all. They feel like a big wasted opportunity. They're so strange.
This is a quick aside, but I'm curious, listening to the Illithids episode, do you think that the show Stranger Things does a decent job at handling this material?
I like that they're kind of bringing those ideas and monsters kind of into the forefront of popular culture a little bit. There's not really any particular relationship to the creatures as they appear in D&D, but it's really cool to see things like the Mind Flayer and Demogorgon sort of appear in popular culture because of this. Well,
and just I have seen enough people like start looking into role-playing games because they saw it on Stranger Things. You know, there's a real resurgence lately in tabletop RPGs that's really cool to see. And, you know, D&D's right at the forefront of it, but it's not the only one doing it.
Another one-on-one question just about RPGs and maybe D&D being kind of like the centerpiece of that. But it seems like it follows a very kind of ancient tradition of just oral storytelling that is kind of passed and made relevant to the group that you're with. Is that true, or is it kind of a newer thing?
I actually have some strong opinions on this because D&D specifically grows out of wargaming. Mm-hmm. To me, it feels like we've only recently rediscovered the sort of community storytelling version of it. That is obviously not true. There are storytelling games dating back to the 80s, but in like the terms of popularity, there's a long period there where D&D is basically just a tabletop war game. And I mean, Zach and I have played D&D games together that were, I mean, 99.9% repeating, just killing monsters with the occasional story cutscene thrown in. And so that's how things used to be played. And seeing more people get more interested in the collaborative storytelling aspect of it and seeing these looser games come in has been mind blowing for me. I love that that's happening. There are so many good games coming.
I think the storytelling aspect of D&D was emergent more. D&D was initially just a framework for, like Scott was saying, wargaming. You sat around the table with your friends and you tried to kill bigger and badder monsters and get more and more treasure. But I think players gradually grew attached to these characters they've created, and the stories started emerging out of that. And I think over time, the focus has become more about the player characters and less about, okay, enter a 10 by 10 room, kill an orc, loot his chest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is rediscovering something that existed in culture before that sort of oral storytelling. Like, yeah, I mean, sort of relate modern RPGs back to the creation of like myths and like folklore, where people are sitting around basically entertaining themselves around a fire by telling each other stories. That's something that goes back to the beginning of history. And in that sense, tabletop role-playing goes back that same distance. It's just now there's structures and story. There's rules to give you a framework. The rules aren't even really there to restrict what you can do. They're really just hooks for you to hang ideas off of and to guide your behavior.
And I think it also kind of prevents a player's natural impulse to marry Sue, where he always succeeds. That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
What do you think your most accessible episode is so far?
Probably dragons, because you don't have to explain to a dragon what a dragon is to most people. There's some level of just sort of cultural embeddedness of dragons that if you say dragon, someone's got a visual idea of what that looks like.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Because I am the producer and editor, I cannot say either of our first two episodes because the audio quality bothers me. I know it doesn't bother other people, but I can't recommend them. But I think the fantasy races episode is a really good first one for a lot of people. It is because we are doing sort of a rapid fire lightning round where we're doing 4 different things all within one episode. It gives you a good overview of kind of how we work. And also dwarves, elves, halflings, and gnomes are all, relatively accessible. They're not, you don't have to search too hard to know what those are. So that would be the one I think I might recommend new people who didn't know anything about us to go to. If not that, then any of our like short episodes is a really they're just little tiny micro versions of what we do. We talk for 5-10 minutes about something and just kind of cut some good bits out of it. You can put that up. Those are always real low investment ways to get in.
And I think if you're looking for perhaps one of my favorite episodes that we've recorded where we just kind of went off the rails and just kept going, which I think is sort of the moment where this podcast shines the most. I think the Trolls episode is probably my favorite there.
Yeah. That may be the best one we've done. That one. Yeah. And it was fun because the moment that we turned off the mic, we were like, that was really good. That was like, we knew immediately how far off we'd gone. But yeah, that Trolls, Chimeras, Umpleby, like any ones where I went into it with an idea of kind of, I know where this is going to go, and got proven very wrong very quickly. I love that. I live for that.
Yeah, I think we both always kind of go into these with maybe a little bit of an agenda, and the best ones are when we just completely veer off course and head into wild territory. I
live for the moment when one of us says something that breaks the other one for a minute. There are a couple of opportunities, and some of them are so great where Zach will say something to me and I'll just I have to sit back in my chair and put my hands on my face and go, oh my God, that is, it'll turn the conversation in a whole new direction. It was something I was far off of my radar, and I love that. I love when that happens.
Yeah. I think just finding that unexpected twist and running with it and seeing where it goes is just It's the best feeling with these episodes.
So through that, are there any iterations of these monsters that you all have explored and elaborated on that you kind of can't go back to the traditional view? Or let me phrase it another way. Are there any popular depictions of these monsters that just kind of drive you crazy? Because you're like, that's just not, it doesn't suffice after you've had this elaboration process?
I think any monster, like especially in role-playing games where the explanation for its existence is a wizard did it, always bothers me.
Yeah. I especially like our version. I mean, of course, like I've never even encountered an Umblebee in real life, or not real life, in a game or anything. It was not used. So there's some of that where it's like you just didn't see it before. But there are some ideas I think are so good. Like going back to that Illithids one of the idea of them eating the memories. As far as I'm concerned, that's how they work now. I don't care what the game says, like what the original, whoever owns that IP, I don't care what they say. This is what they are. That's what they do. It makes so much more sense than what they originally said, probably. Oh, and for the record, all elves have antlers. If I ever see media where elves don't have antlers, they are wrong now.
Yes. And that's kind of what it is for me. And again, coming from my perspective of somebody who's only thought of this stuff typically as presented through popular culture, I already find myself kind of looking down on some of the... And this is kind of going in a circle of saying how some of these IPs seem like they were lazily developed, but it's kind of, I'm in this exact same boat of like, I want the universe to be a living and breathing thing that exists within the rules of its own universe. Yeah. And I guess that some of these things do that as they are popularly presented, but it still seems like maybe just because we're in the 21st century and we're so much more seeking that authenticity or that kind of complete view, it's just it's time for all of this to evolve. I think to that next level.
Well, and you can see there are people out there doing that. It's not a fantasy version of it, but The Expanse is the one I'd point to that. If you read the books or even just watch the show, amazingly, the television show takes so much of the forethought that the books have had and just keeps it. And that's a fully realized world, as far as I'm concerned. Those guys do such a good job. There are people out there making that kind of content. That they've got a fully realized world. It's in there.
And I feel some of Sanderson's books do a much better job of that, where there's definitely a very unique, interesting world with systems that are internally consistent, that also don't detract from the story itself. You're not just sitting here reading a documentary about this particular world. There's actually a good story tied in with that as well.
Yeah, as much as I love Tolkien, that dude was just making a world there was a story happening in it, but what he was doing was making a world, and he was just giving you the history of it. If you ever got any kind of chance, I love him. I'm not bashing Tolkien. Those books are seminal, and they only seem dated now and cliche because everybody else copied them. Like all of the things that seem rote in those books is because everybody else just did the same thing. But yeah, when you're reading one of the books and it goes on for 2 pages on the history of the hill they passed. Oh God.
Yeah, it's it really is an exercise in detail reading those books. I want to think about like what are some pop culture and try to divorce the books as much as possible. I'm curious about the film adaptations or television, or we could even maybe say video games that you guys think do it the best. That they're the closest to a realized, fully fleshed monster.
I feel like some of the best ones are ones that don't start with a monster that has any sort of presuppositions. Like, and a lot of the time that will lend itself to things like horror, where you've got a creature that has a very big unknown. Because as soon as you name something, or like if you say this is a goblin, suddenly everyone has some presuppositions about what it is, what it's going to look like, what it's going to do, and when it doesn't or does meet those expectations, someone's going to be disappointed.
Yeah. A really interesting world is the Avatar, The Last Airbender world.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially in the sequel Legend of Korra, when you start to get more of an insight into, they have the spirit world in that world where there's an interaction between sort of I don't even know how to describe it. Except as the spirit world. It's this world where all of these other creatures that are sort of adjacent to our own live, and it has entrances and exits on certain parts of the world, and like how that interacts with their world, and then how these great big nations where everybody has elemental powers, not everybody, but lots and lots of people have elemental powers, interact, and how that creates opportunities within the world for things like technological development, because you can use fire and electricity, and you can do such and such with, moving earth and things like that. The people who were thinking those ideas were doing the kind of stuff I love, where they're like, oh yeah, if you can move rock, then why don't you make a trolley car out of rock and then have some guys move it, and then you can transport people. And it's like, that's a brilliant idea. I love that. And it's just a background element in one episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender where they're just constantly thinking of that same idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, well, so as an outsider, you said you liked the races episode a lot, but you were most interested in the xenomorph because that's where you had the most into it. So do you feel like there was a pretty strong correlation between how familiar you were with the idea to begin with and how much you were able to engage with it while you were hearing me and Zach talk?
Absolutely. Yeah. I also just think that I have not only more familiarity, but also more, I don't necessarily want to say interest, but I have had my own exercise similar to Monster Mechanics before,
right,
with my thinking of the alien.
Right.
And or the xenomorph, and my thinking of some of the shortcomings of its presentation, especially as the series would evolve.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
I really resonate with the idea that, and this is kind of what Zach was talking about when there's no presupposition. I think the earlier you can get to the core, the genesis idea, the more pure and better it is, right, I'll say. And the further they try to do what I think is the same process that we're doing here, the more it starts to kind of falter.
Yeah. I mean, specifically on the xenomorph.
Yeah.
When you lose, like they didn't bring H.R. Giger back for the remainder of the movies. In fact, he tried apparently on Alien 3 to come back in and do work for them, and they told him no, which is bonkers to me. When like what that creature looks like is because of that guy. And so like the heart of that idea is in the weirdness of it, in that biomechanical horror. And as much as I love the Aliens movie, they became fodder. Like a bunch of xenomorphs get blown up in that movie, and I love that movie to death. But like that, they're not the same creature anymore. The moment that you like just introduce more than one of them, that's such a simple change of taking from one to multiple changes what they are, and that kind of cuts the heart out of them. Yeah, that's I could talk. I can bitch about the Aliens movies for a long time.
Well, and the parallel, and of course it was referenced in the episode, is the Predator alien, which I have spent so much time and intellectual energy expanding that, and what I think is making it better, because there's so much about the Predator, and also, I love the original Predator movie.
Yeah.
It's kind of a guilty pleasure. It's just so fun and so over the top. It's brilliant. But I've always had a problem with a lot of things that are depicted in that. One is how I don't like how big and bulky the Predator is. I've always thought that he should be a little bit more nimble and almost looking like a giant kind of, I don't want to say tree frog.
I like that.
But something with really long limbs, so that it can climb. It can run really fast. And even the way that its cloaking works, I always imagined when the Predator is moving, you can kind of make out like a rough shape.
Yeah.
But once it stops, that's when it, that camouflage comes in.
Yeah.
I love the idea of that camouflage being something like biological rather than
technological. I mean, I don't want to do a whole episode on predators right now, although we probably could. But the thing that came to mind with me is that I hate that their entire society is built around like going and big game hunting on random backwards planets. Like, no, just no. So if you like have the guy like at the end of the movie, if the predator went back to its home planet, and everybody's like, why do you do that? Like, why? It's like, specifically, it's you, Mr. Predator, who went to Earth. Like, why are you doing that?
And also,
like,
Randy, no one calls you the Predator.
Yeah. And like, there's just like the same species, but they're accountants and like spaceship engineers and stuff. That's the version that I want to see, as boring as that is. That's the much better version.
Well, it makes it more relatable, which kind of can make it a little creepier too. Because if you think about them as aliens, just having their own complex civilization, and there's maybe a few outliers, kind of the good old boys of this alien tribe or this alien species who like to go out and do this.
Yeah.
I agree though, and I can't wait to hear the episode on Predator, because I think the concept is good. There's a lot of good stuff to work with in the first one, but man, I think there's so many things they can do for a true reboot if they ever wanted to do that, where they just completely reimagine how the Predator operates and how it looks.
Yeah,
because it's kind of stale. I mean, every time there's a new Predator thing that comes out, it's kind of like it's just this giant 8-foot bulky thing that like wouldn't even move that way, you know? And that's always kind of driven me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, and to broaden that out, there's a big problem with aliens being too normal. Like okay. You asked a little while ago about a movie that had a really good representation of a monster, and that's Arrival.
Oh yeah.
As much as I'm not totally bought in onto the idea that learning a new language could let you see the future. Almost everything else in that movie is wonderfully done, where they accurately depict like how you could try to figure out a language with another creature. They have a language which is like beautifully strange. Like it's circular. Like the idea of your sentences being written as a glyph and can be read the same way forward and back. Like that's great. I love the fact that you only see kind of part of these creatures, and the part of them that you see is like not like, you can't even imagine, like you kind of think of it as a hand, but it might not be, and it could just as easily be something else. And they like that is brilliantly done. I love all of that. And the fact that just the image of that huge ship just hanging in the sky as though it doesn't care about our laws of physics. I love that image. That's so good.
Yeah, I think a lot of the problem with aliens kind of dates back to how they've initially been portrayed, which was guys in rubber suits.
Yeah.
They didn't have a budget to do, big special effects like that.
Yeah.
And when they did, it looked very hokey. So there's always been kind of like this, if you're making an alien, he's got to be kind of bipedal.
Yeah.
But I think the places where it succeeds, especially recently, is where you kind of branch away from that and you get away from that human-centric notion of aliens.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, we're coming up on probably the end of our episode here, so I think we're gonna close it out. Under our normal circumstances, I have a little outro where I say, you can reach us at MonsterMPod on Twitter, or you can go to our Patreon, patreon.com/monsterpod, or go to our website, monsterpod.org. You can also find us individually. I am at Scott Paladin on Twitter.
Sure, I'm at Pictoglyphic.
I am at Luke Lukas on Twitter, and Lucas is spelled with a K.
That's going to be us then. Bye.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this Monster Mechanics bonus episode. I would normally tell you our social media links, but it seems that Scott of the past has already taken care of that. However, we have not yet told you about our next episode, which will be next week, Dryads.